So I had to work with WSRP. I didn't know anything about WSRP either, to be honest. So I guess you guys would know this, but in 5.2.3, the portal didn't support WSRP. But starting with version 6, it did support WSRP. So my first challenge was, what do? Do I try and apply WSRP to 5.2.3, or do I migrate all these plugins to use version 6 and leverage what Liferay offers me automatically? Migration is the key point here. That's right. My first experience with Liferay was a migration project. Who's done a migration in Liferay here? Aren't they fun? That was really a tipping point for me though, right? Because if I had a negative migration experience, it might have really turned me off the product. But for me, actually, this was the point where I fell in love with Liferay. My migration was relatively painless. I'm not going to say it was perfect, but between my coworker and I and one of the Liferay partners in North America, we were able to work through the challenges and get the plugins working. So once we had the WSRP support kind of ironed out, we switched to the next stage, which was to some customizations, which of course is bread and butter Liferay. So we had to do some data stuff and some security stuff. To solve both of these problems, we used the Service Builder API and the Impersonation API. This is where I literally fell out of my chair in love with Liferay. We had estimated 4 to 6 months to complete these tasks, mostly because we had no idea how big it was going to be and how difficult it was going to be. But between the dev tooling that Service Builder provided and the rich APIs that the impersonation feature provided, we were able to complete this project, or these requirements for the project, in record time. I think it was like a month, maybe less. So there were 3 vendors on this project, but in the eyes of the client, Indeka, or me, was the all-star, the rock star, because everyone else was struggling and we were done. Now, although Indeka was perceived as the star, everyone at Indeka, my coworker and I and my boss, knew that Liferay was the reason. It wasn't because we had done something exceptional. We had just used the tools that were provided to us by Liferay to be successful. So, I mean, talk about a great career move, right? I'm now programming again. I found this product that I love. My client and my boss think that I'm an amazing rock star developer. Life is good. I'm making good money. I'm happy. I go home at 5 o'clock because I have no problems on my project. It's great. But then, someone who I don't want to name, oops, now I have to go back 1 sec. I'm such a rookie with Keynote that this is the only way I know to do it. Someone who's not going to be named, but you can fill in the 2 blanks there. I don't know if they bought the company or the company sold to them. Either way, it didn't matter. So Oracle did offer most of us jobs, and quite good ones, to be honest. But I had long been thinking about maybe going out on my own, so I thought maybe this is the sign. Maybe this is the opportunity for me to start my own practice. And so I decided that that was what I wanted to do. And I decided that because I had been working with Liferay, and I was so in love with Liferay, that some of these services I wanted to offer should include Liferay. The problem was that even though I was using Liferay at Indeka, I was really using just a very thin strip of the top. I wasn't really deep in the product. So I had to become an expert because I couldn't really brand myself as an expert at this stage. It'd be a bit of a reach. I'd be a true consultant, lying in your face all the time. So that takes me to the next part of my journey, which I call discovering Liferay. So Monday morning, I sat down on my desk of my newly minted company, quite proud that I now owned something, with my cup of coffee, and I thought I'll just pick up Liferay. It'd be no big deal. I'll get some contracts next week, and everything will be fine. And how do you learn a product? You start with documentation, of course. You go to the website, you do the installation guide, you read the developer guide, maybe an API. Easy peasy. So I started with my browser, and I started looking for things related to Liferay. And here's what I found. Or it certainly felt like this, to be honest. And I'm sure many of you have been in a situation where you feel like this when you search for information on Liferay from time to time. Now, I mean, this is actually a bit of an exaggeration. First of all, I would never be walking in the desert. But I did find stuff, but the stuff I found was for the version I wasn't working with, or it was inaccurate or incomplete, or, I mean, maybe there was some really good stuff that I found, but I didn't yet have enough knowledge of the product to be able to take advantage of it. So how do you overcome this obstacle? You see, I'm not really good with the graphics because I noticed this morning that this has a watermark on it. which is pretty embarrassing, but anyway, try and look past it. So how do you move past? How do I become an expert, right? I had turned down this great job offer from Oracle, and I wanted to go on my own. I wanted to be successful. So first I took a deep breath, to be honest, because I started to panic. Then I started to think about all the times where I wanted to learn something and I couldn't find the information. What did I do? Well, I like to seek out experts, other people I can talk to and ask questions. So I connected to the Freenode IRC server and joined the Liferay channel. I think Brian Chan actually touched on this yesterday, and I laughed when I saw it. This is kind of the bridge between the days of BBSs and the World Wide Web. And in desperation, and then because I'm a dinosaur, that's the only thing I could come up with, I joined this channel. And there were actually people in the channel. Now, there was nobody actually saying anything in the channel, but there were people there. So I started posting questions thinking, if someone's paying attention, maybe they'll answer. And it took a little bit of time, but eventually I started getting answers. And I noticed that there were 3 or 4 guys, Ray Auger, believe it or not, James Faulkner, the former community manager, Carlos Sierra answered some of my questions, and Tomas, I don't know his last name. I mean, I know his last name, I just can't say it. He's in the security group. But they were all really helpful. They didn't laugh at my questions. They didn't call me dumb or anything like that. They just wanted to provide me with the answers I needed. So once I understood a little bit more about the product, I then discovered the message boards. And there I found people like David who were answering everyone's questions. But I didn't know what to ask. So I started by reading other people's messages to understand what other people were doing with the product and what problems they were having. Then I started trying the solutions that were being proposed. I would reproduce the error, put the solution in place, and see how it worked. And eventually, I tried to answer other people's questions. Now, it didn't go so well at first. A lot of the time, I would provide someone the wrong answer. But that was still a positive experience because the rest of the people in the forums didn't mock me or heckle me because I gave the wrong answer. I mean, David does from time to time, but for the most part, people would politely correct you, and then you get more information. So it's great. The problem at this stage, though, was I had all these bits and pieces of information, but I didn't have a clear end-to-end kind of picture. So I went out and I bought a book. And I know that doesn't sound like a really intelligent or revolutionary step, but if you understood how slow a reader I am, you would realize this is a serious investment of my time, to be honest. So the book I bought was Liferay in Action by Manning Press. It's not going to help you with 7, but I would still suggest that you buy it and read it if you haven't, because a lot of the concepts that you see in 7 were still there in the earlier versions of the product. I think the one I bought actually was for 6.0. It wasn't even updated for the 6.2. Then one day I was working on something, trying to implement something, and I was sure that I had found a bug. I wasn't sure how to troubleshoot this, so I took the next step of I downloaded and set up the Liferay portal source code on my machine. I started looking through the code, and I quickly discovered that I was actually doing something wrong. It wasn't a bug. And I fixed it. But then I found that even after I found my solution, I continued to weave through the source code. I went from method to method, from class to class, package to package. And in a very short period of time, like let's say the span of a day, I had doubled my knowledge of the product. Now, I still didn't know very much at this time, right? So 2 times a little is actually just a little bit more. But the point is that the methodology that I was using to learn and enhance my knowledge of the product was faster using the source code than any other means I had found to date. I had a client once tell me that we don't need to show the client how the sausage is made. We just need to give them the sausage. So this has always painted this picture in my mind for me. Right? We all know what happens here. The pig is not going to have a good day. Right? We know he goes in and we know the sausage comes out, but most of us don't know what happens inside the factory to produce the sausage. And most of us probably don't want to know because we like sausages, and if we knew, we probably wouldn't eat them anymore. But open source became, for me, open book. And I know that might sound stupid to a lot of you, like, well, obviously, buddy. But everything I had done to date had been closed products, black boxes, where something went in, something came out. I was just at the mercy of what it did. But by opening the source code for Liferay, it was like opening the door to the factory. I could see the request come in. I could see how it moved through the whole ecosystem, how each individual property or configuration setting affected the request, how a response was formed and sent back to the user. It was a huge epiphany for me and a major step for me in my Liferay journey, which takes me to the next phase, which I call mastering Liferay. So As I studied the source code, I found myself spending more and more time in the source code. Patterns started to emerge. I noticed that there were class names that were being used consistently, either postfix or prefix. I noticed that the package structure was the same from one portlet to the next, from one module to the next. And I found these building blocks that really accelerated my development. Things like the AUI tag libraries. I know tag libraries are ancient, JSP, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, if you are forced to use them, one line of code can sometimes produce for you dozens that you don't have to write on your own. So once I recognized this pattern and I studied one particular feature and I mastered that feature, I then realized as I moved to the next feature that the same pattern was being applied. And as I moved from one feature to the next, it was just rinse and repeat. I mean, instead of calling it a journal article local service util, you called it a blogs local service util. But you knew that if you wanted to find out how to add that thing, you had to go look for that service. So at this point, I feel that I had a feature knowledge kind of explosion, and my expertise reached a level where I stopped looking for work for anybody who didn't use Liferay. And in fact, the few people that did come to me that didn't use Liferay, the first thing I did is I tried to convince them to use Liferay. This is also around the time I started giving back to the community, because I felt that I had understood or I had amassed enough knowledge of the product that I wanted to give back to the community that had given so much to me. Nobody had ever asked me for anything in return. I felt that this was my turn to give back. So now we're, the heydays of 6.2, the glory days, I like to call them. So I've got this fairly successful company going. I mean, I'm making mortgage payments, so that's not bad. I've got multiple clients and numerous successful deliveries. I've been to a few conferences and connected with Liferay people and other members of the community. Liferay asked me to become a forums moderator. They didn't tell me that it didn't pay very well when they asked me, and I agreed. But, there is some social payment, I guess, in there. I contributed some dev life sessions that showed corner cases or unexpected uses of the product. And I had earned several top contributor awards. And there was more. It was just the beginning of my Liferay career. And then, wait for it, and then Liferay 7 and OSGI. So I was not totally ignorant to Liferay 7 and OSGI. I had watched the videos that Ray did where he talked about how awesome it's going to be and how much better Liferay will be for it. I tried to build some OSGI Eclipse extensions. They totally failed, but it was just to get my feet wet kind of thing. I even participated as part of the expeditionary team that was responsible for finding bugs in the milestone releases of the product before the GA went out. I think Jamie's actually wearing the t-shirt from that project. If I'm not, I still have mine too, buddy. But so I was at the point now where clients were starting to ask me about upgrading from 6.2 to 7, and some new clients were saying, should I choose 6.2 or 7? And I wasn't really sure. I was exposed to it, but it was really surface level exposure. I wasn't an expert yet. So I figured, okay, I better get in on this. It's been out for a few months. I've delayed long enough. Time to start on Liferay. But I mean, I'm an expert, right? How hard could it be? So this is where I go to what I call the fall from grace. It was the point at which my ego was checked and Liferay literally kicked my butt one day. I downloaded 7, I installed it, I started playing with it, and basically the result for me was shock and confusion. That's the only way I can think to describe my initial experience with 7. And I think probably for a lot of you, it might be something similar. First thing I noticed was there were some things that seemed familiar, but there was a lot of it that seemed completely new. And it was very confusing. Things that I was accustomed to doing, I was now struggling to do. That's okay. I have a back to my roots kind of approach when this happens. Now that I'm engrossed in open source, I downloaded the source code and I started looking through it. But then all the things I was looking for were not where I thought that they should be. And in fact, it seemed like a huge section of the product was completely missing. So much so, actually, that I thought at one point that maybe I had downloaded the wrong file. It's okay, the message boards, that'll save me. Questions and answers. Well, what I found in the message boards were people asking questions like, does anybody know what this error message means? Does anybody know how to do this in 7? Does anybody know where I can find that? And it wasn't just new people to Liferay. The part that was most disconcerting about this situation was it was people like me, people I know had been using the product forever, who didn't know how to do anything anymore. So documentation, right? You can't release a new product without good docs. Yeah, well, the early days of 7 documentation were not so great. The documentation was sparse and often out of date. I mean, the docs now are awesome. I love them. But in the early days, it didn't do anything to help. So I switched to the GitHub samples. I got them to work. I got them to deploy. But it's hard to draw a line between these complicated 6.2 plugins you've been building and a Hello World portlet in OSGI. So I didn't understand how I was ever going to do that kind of stuff I had done with the last version in this new version. So at the end of the day, I was left with mysterious error messages, build failure, I hate that message more than anything, dependency failures, and no idea how to fix them, of course, APIs that had changed, or things that I was accustomed to doing, like using configuration as a core part of every solution I build, I no longer knew how to do. The terminology had changed, so I didn't even know how to ask questions. Basically, nothing was working, and I was extremely frustrated. So what do you do when you're a developer, and you're a seasoned developer, and you reach this point? Well, obviously, you do this, right? At least that's what I felt like doing. I didn't. But what I felt, though, honestly, was I felt like I had gone back to where I was when I had joined Endeca. Like Liferay was this whole new product that I didn't know anymore. I had formed this company, and I had spent a number of years basically pigeonholing my services into this one thing. How was I going to do this? How was I going to keep going? How was I going to get clients? I couldn't answer them anymore. So this is where the search for answers starts. I started by taking a deep breath. I do that a lot, by the way. Then I reinstalled the portal source. Yes, in a moment of juvenile behavior when I was frustrated, I had highlighted that folder and hit delete, and it felt really good when I did it, but that was obviously not going to be a long-term solution, so I put it back. Then I started searching the source for things that I knew could not have gone missing. Things like the string pool class. I mean, why would you replace that with something new? The local service utils, you're not gonna gut that whole part of the project. So as I looked for these classes that I was familiar with, I started trying to identify where they had moved in the directory tree of the source code. And I found that code I was missing, by the way. It was under the modules folder, under apps. So I found all the stuff I was looking for. And so I just spent a lot of time trying to understand how everything had been broken up. And actually, in that process, I then had a clear understanding of this thing called modularity that I've been hearing about for a couple of years, but could never really see something tangible with. Once I felt I understood enough about how the restructuring had occurred, I went back to the forums and I started asking my own questions. And I used a lot of the wrong terms, like I said, the service when it should have been a component, or a component when it should have been a service, and that kind of stuff. But eventually, what I found was everyone was back there talking about this release, some people upset, some people just trying to find answers, and the sharing of information in the community allowed me to define or understand new patterns. And from my perspective, there were 4 key changes that I had to overcome. There was Gradle, an amazing build tool, but a monster nonetheless. But you don't need to be an expert in Gradle to work with Liferay. I mean, you don't have to use Gradle if you don't want to, but if you are going to use Gradle, it's enough to know just the basic Gradle. A half a dozen kind of tasks that you need to execute, some of them that are custom to Liferay and some just to get your stuff on the server. The same thing for OSGI. OSGI is a huge specification. I don't understand most of it, to be honest, but a handful of annotations and the properties you can assign to them and how they affect the service initialization and the injection and the references, that's all you really need to understand to get started. There was this new project structure called Liferay Workspace, which made me feel a bit like I'd gone back to the Ant days, to be honest, but there were new parts of it. So I needed to understand what these properties files were and how they worked and what the best practices were on how to use it. And lastly, I had to learn this new terminology. If I was going to ask questions, I had to ask the right questions. So once I learned these terms, I then had to go on to start building some plugins. So really, once I accepted that these were the 4 key changes, what I decided was that the majority of the product had not changed. You still have Service Builder, you still have portal instances and groups and users and roles. Friendly URLs are still defined in XML file, same with the resource actions. All the bread and butter that you do with the older versions of Liferay, you still do in the new version of Liferay. That hasn't changed. So the mantra, the way you go about identifying whether you use a model listener or a service wrapper or an index post processor, all those things remain the same. What had changed was the wrapper, the way you package these things to get them into your application. So then I started building some plugins. I took some of my 6.2 plugins and I converted them to OSGI. I didn't use that WAB bundler thing. I rebuilt them using the OSGI architecture. And then I built some new plugins that I had on my list but never really got around to building. And I refactored and I broke them and I refactored and refactored. And eventually, I would say probably 2 to 4 weeks max, because I wasn't unemployed for that long, I felt like I was back on top. I started delivering 7.x solutions for my clients, and honestly, they love them. They love them more than anything I've done in 6.2, because all the great stuff I could do in 6.2, I could now do in 7, but I could make it even more dynamic. So this is where I am now, the new part of my journey. I call this a new hope. There's a lot of Star Wars references, so I thought I should get in on that, you know. And this is where I am now. 7, 7.1, 7.2 that's coming, everything else. Okay, tools, tips, and tricks. Oh yeah, I was going to tell you that I was going to tell you this. I forgot to say that part at the beginning, so surprise. Actually, there's probably nothing revolutionary that I'm going to show you, to be honest. Probably a lot of things you see you already use, but maybe there's something different. And if you don't see with something that you use up there, share it. So on the Liferay side, we have the obvious stuff that we've been hearing about for the last couple of days. The blogs, the forums, Slack, documentation, this new Liferay University thing, and DXP. Now, I had an interesting conversation last night with Chris, actually, where he was saying, you know, it's so frustrating when I look for an answer for 7 and all I find are answers, but they're 6.2. That's definitely a frustrating point. However, what you should do if you see that is you should either reply to that thread and say, how do you do this in 7? Or start a new thread specifically for 7. So the next guy that comes along finds the 6.2 answer, but also the 7 answer. The message forums are a huge helper in alleviating blocks for other developers. Product documentation is awesome. I think we should really tip our hats to that team. I think they've come a long way. And there's a lot to document. It's really hard. I think a lot of the time, the stuff you're looking for might actually be in the documentation. You just don't know where to look for it. So my recommendation for those situations and what I do is I go to the Slack channel and I say, hey guys, I have this requirement where I have to do this. What do you guys recommend I should do? And if somebody says, oh, you should use a blah, 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 that I don't know about, then I say, awesome, where do I find out more about that? And 9 out of 10 times, someone can point me to a page in the documentation. It's not going to be everything I need to complete my requirement, but it's a starter, and with a little bit of creativity and reading between the lines, most of the time I find the answer. DXP might seem like a weird one to see up here, but for those of you who have never worked with DXP, when you have a DXP license, it actually comes with not just support for bug fixes and security, but it also includes a customer portal that has a whole other set of documentation for more enterprise level problems like, you know, federated authentication and stuff like that. So it's something to consider if your client has the money for it. Now, other resources that I use on a regular basis, it's silly, I know, but a diff tool. I am constantly looking at the old version of code versus the new version of code to see how it's changed. I'm actually not starred. Is it the star that sends you an email from GitHub? I can't remember. Whichever one it is, that I get the emails for every commit that happens to the Liferay products. And I don't read all the emails because there are a lot of commits that happen in a day. But every now and then I scan through them, especially if I see one from a repository that I know that I'm using on a project, to see what's changed, to understand how is this going to impact me in the future. IRC is still there, believe it or not. I thought I should check if I'm going to put it up here. There's only like 6 people in the channel. One's a bot, and the subject hasn't been changed since 2016. But, you know, if somebody's bothering to log in, then you might actually be able to get an answer there. GitHub has 3,460 projects tagged with Liferay. Now, there's a whole set of those that are, of course, Liferay's specific projects, but I've often found from other, you know, regular Joes like all of us, public repositories that show anything from an example of how to use a feature of the product to integration with some obscure third-party platform. Even if I don't find exactly what I'm looking for, I've learned a lot just from looking at other people's code in here. Parts of Liferay's API is so big. You know, I'm familiar with this part of it, and I tend to use what I already know. And every now and then I come across a new class, a new util, a new something, new service that I didn't even know existed. Stack Overflow has many questions. There is a lot of overlap with the message forms, but I have come across questions in Stack Overflow that are not in the Liferay message boards. And they don't always come up in a Google search result, believe it or not. Independent bloggers, There are some good sites out there. Some of them are really difficult to look at because they're really, really ugly, but they have good content. So you got to just kind of move past the visuals. I'm sure most of you have probably seen LiferaySavvy.com. He's got a lot of 6.2 stuff, but I know he has posted some 7. I recently learned about LiferayStack.com, I think it's called. I think it's supposed to be a play on the Stack Overflow idea. He's got some good stuff too. Third-party sites and docs. This is an important one because often I find people complain about not being able to find the answer to something that is actually documented somewhere else. Right, so Liferay uses FreeMarker as an example. Oh, I wish I knew how to do this thing in FreeMarker, but no one can tell me. You could go look at the FreeMarker documentation on the FreeMarker site. They might have written it down there. Remember, Liferay uses a lot of open source products as well as part of its platform. So some of the stuff you're looking for might actually be documented somewhere else. Social. I am not really a big social media user, to be honest. There's actually a Twitter handle in here. I've never sent a tweet in my life, to be honest. But I have found in the past, from time to time, resources on YouTube, on Reddit, on Twitter. There's actually a guy in Italy, Dennis Signoretto. I'm probably butchering his name. He has a great blog, so I probably should have mentioned him in the independent bloggers. But he actually tweets when he posts to his blog. So if you just follow this guy, then you'll get his articles whenever they come up. But the Liferay community is one thing I think people don't leverage. Don't sit alone in the corner frustrated. Ask, speak up. I know as developers, we're worried about what other people think about us. I think the keynote this morning was talking about that. We're so worried about what other people are going to think when I ask a silly question. But chances are there are 100 or 1,000 other people with the same silly question. You just have to have the courage to ask it. But lastly, I know you guys are going to roll your eyes, but read the source. I know people think that that's not a solution, but it is a solution. That's why you're using open source. Because you don't have to rely on a document that's written like a novel to tell you how to do something. 90% of what you want to do has probably already been done by Liferay in one part of the product. You just have to go find it and copy and paste it. I mean, the other day, I was working with a friend of mine in Montreal. His name's Julien Mourad, and he does all the front-end stuff. And we wanted to build a portlet, and we wanted to have a toggle switch. And so I went to, I can't remember what that's, CodePen or something, and I got this huge block of code, and I put it in. And Julian looked at it and he said, "Oh my God, what are you doing? Look at this garbage, this custom CSS right in line and everything." He said, "Why don't you just use a Liferay toggle?" And I said, "I don't know how to do that." And he said, "Come here." And he searched the source code and he said, "Here, in the control panel, they're using a toggle. So you see it's an AUI tag library. You just put the input type to input toggle and it just draws it for you. There, you're done." Amazing, right? All you had to do was search the source code. So I find myself and Julian, actually, I can speak for him since he's not here, probably 50% of the time that we're looking for an answer, we start with the source code. We go right in there and start searching for things that we know would be called. So, recap. I don't even know how I'm doing for time, to be honest. I told you a bit about who I am, how I got introduced to Liferay, how I discovered Liferay, how I mastered Liferay, the dark ages between 6, 2, and 7 when I fell from grace, and then kind of where I am now. This is what I want you to take away from this session, because I didn't give you any code that you could go back and compile and deploy and see all the cool stuff. But what I wanted to share with you is that change is hard, and change is hard for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're an expert or a novice. And on that same subject, everyone struggles. Whether you've been doing it forever or you're doing it for the first time, struggles are something that everyone experiences. But the point is, at least with Liferay, you're not alone. The community is here to help. But to get that help, you have to have the courage to ask. Okay, so I've shared with all of you guys my story and how I got involved with Liferay. And now it's time for you guys to share your story with me, because I'd love to hear how other people got involved with the product, even if it was not, in the best of ways. So, the conference is not over yet. We have a few hours left. It's lunchtime. Tap me on the shoulder, introduce yourself, and tell me your story. Okay? Thank you guys.